For much too long, the history of what took place here was told in silence, cloaked in darkness. But just because history is silent, it doesn't mean that it did not take place. And while darkness can hide much, it erases nothing. It erases nothing. Some injustices are so heinous, so horrific, so grievous, they can't be buried, no matter how hard people try.
President Biden in Oklahoma 2 years ago, marking the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa massacre. On this day in 1921, a mob terrorized the Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, a flourishing black business district affectionately called Black Wall Street. Historians believe hundreds of people were killed and more than 1,000 homes and businesses were burned. Joining us now, journalist Victor Luckerson. He's the author of the new book, Built from the Fire, the epic story of Tulsa's Greenwood district, America's Black Wall Street. Thank you for coming on the show to share this book with us. You actually moved to Tulsa and lived there for 3 years while writing this book to truly understand the people of Greenwood. What did you find?
You know, it was so important to me crafting this story to create a narrative that really centered people. Not statistics, not trauma, but actual people. And it was such an amazing experience meeting the folks of Greenwood, in particular, the Goodwin family. There's one family in Greenwood who has remained on Black Wall Street for more than 110 years. They were there before the race massacre. The Goodwins survived the massacre itself. Ed Goodwin was actually a high school senior, about to graduate high school, go to college, continue with his life when his entire community was destroyed. His home, his business, the family business, the hospital, so much of that community was taken from him. But it's also important to understand that the Goodwins and so many others were able to rebuild in Greenwood. They were able to recreate this community after 1921 and have a new, thriving legacy. You know, one great thing about learning about the Goodwin family was they really served every single role you can in a community. From educators to attorneys to activists, this family has really been fighting for justice in this community for so long. You know, if you go to Greenwood today, you'll see a lot of high-rises, a baseball stadium, so many things that are not really for the black community. But we still have the Oklahoma Eagle right there in the neighborhood, the business that the Goodwin family has owned for more than 80 years. And so really it was a blessing and a privilege to be able to sort of share their story and the stories of so many of the families in Greenwood who have been resilient, not only during the race massacre, but for generations afterwards.
We came into this segment showing President Biden at the 100th anniversary of the massacre, and Reverend Al, you were there with him. If you have a question for Victor, take it away, but also your thoughts 2 years later.
My thoughts are, first, I was very happy the president put that kind of light on it. And I think it's important to say that in many ways we've had issues. I've been to Tulsa many times on police brutality cases that happened right there. But so that many of the issues are still there. The Tulsa massacre started with some misinformation about a young black, I'm sure Victor knows that, and it exploded and they burned down that section. But I think what's important, and I wish Victor would elaborate on it, is that a lot of Americans don't understand these self-contained, economically stable, black business-oriented communities that existed. I think they think everyone was just poor, squalor, irresponsible, and Greenwood represented the kinds of communities that blacks had done on their own and was handling on their own that was just destroyed because of some racial onslaught. And Greenwood is trying to build back even as they deal with some of the continuing social issues. Talk about that, Victor. I can't wait to read your book on it.
Well, thank you so much, Reverend Sharpton. And that really is one of the main things I wanted to highlight when I wrote this story. You know, I'm a young black man from Alabama, and when I was growing up, so many of the stories that we were told about our history only centered on black trauma. Black people being enslaved during the Civil War, being beaten and hosed by dogs during the Civil Rights Movement. But Greenwood is more than just its trauma. You know, I just actually finished writing a story for the New York Times about W.E.B. Du Bois' admiration for Greenwood. Du Bois, a great sociologist, was also an economist. He visited Greenwood actually in 1921, just months before the race massacre, and he marveled at the closed economy they had created with black folks trading among themselves. You know, Du Bois, for example, marveled at the Dreamland Theater, owned by a black woman, Lula Williams, and the fact that she was able to keep people coming to her theater, even though they had a white theater right across the street. You know, folks in Greenwood said, no, we want to serve our black community, our black businesses. And they really created something that was really gaining national admiration from folks like Du Bois. It's such a tragedy that what these folks had built was destroyed so savagely by white folks in Tulsa in 1921. And I think it's also really important to highlight that, you know, we have a lot of fixation on the mob. There's this idea that there was a white mob in Tulsa that descended on the community, burned it down. And some folks might assume that this is kind of quote-unquote low-class white people. But, you know, take a look at some of the photographs. You'll see men in suits who were part of this mob. You'll see men in the National Guard observing the burning of Greenwood. We know for a fact, for example, that it was the City of Tulsa Police Department that deputized white people, not even knowing some of their names. And the city police commissioner later admitted that some of those folks applied the torch to Greenwood. And so it's really important that people understand that in this brutal attack, it was not just low-class whites. It was not just some sort of other group of people in the community. These were everyday white Tulsans, from the average Joe to the, you know, the white elite of that community who burned down the community in 1921.
Victor, good morning and congratulations on the book. We should remind people that in less than 24 hours, 35 city blocks were charred, 800 people treated for injuries. Historians now believe as many as 300 people were killed. 1,250 homes were burned to the ground. And the idea for these white people was to run that thriving black community out of town. But as you write in the book, they stayed, which raises the question to me is what compelled them to stay in a place that showed them such hatred?
You know, I have a chapter in my book about the days after the massacre, when there was, you know, rubble littering the streets, you know, haze in the air. You know, the world still smoldered in Greenwood in those days afterwards. But I learned about this meeting they had in the one black church that survived, First Baptist, a couple of weeks after the race massacre. The principal of the elementary school, which was burned, had this quote. He said that, "I'm not going to give up what I have until I get what I lost." And that power, that was so resonant to me, this idea that these folks were not going to be run out of town, as you say. They were not going to be the Negroes run out of Tulsa. That was put on a postcard that white folks wanted to happen. They refused to let that happen to them. I think that shows the commitment they had to their own community. The solidarity that Greenwood had that we celebrate so much today was so evident right after the attack. And, you know, it really was about folks coming together and working together. We had the black churches in the community raising funds to help each other. We had a group called the Colored Citizens Relief Committee, which attracted mutual aid from groups like the NAACP, bringing those funds into Greenwood so they could manage to rebuild. And importantly, we had a lot of legal recourse, too. There's actually a Greenwood survivor, B.C. Franklin, and I had the privilege of actually interviewing with his grandson, John W. Franklin, at the Smithsonian yesterday. B.C. Franklin was an attorney in the community who filed a legal injunction against the white folks of Tulsa who were trying to prevent black people from rebuilding their homes using city ordinances and other tactics like that. And so between mutual aid, legal recourse, and an indomitable spirit, the folks of Greenwood refused to be moved after 1921.
The new book is entitled Built from the Fire, the epic story of Tulsa's Greenwood District, America's Black Wall Street. Victor Luckerson, thank you very much for writing the book and for sharing it with us this morning on Morning Joe. Thanks for being on.
Thank you so much.